I never thought that I would have been on a panel discussion relating to oil and gas. Oil and gas raises my stress level and it raises my anxiety level, especially when there's so much information coming in at one time. But there's a difficulty at the same time assessing, one, where the information is coming from, and two, who really is controlling the narrative. Should I really believe the things that I'm reading? And that's what gives me anxiety. My entire presentation will be based on the idea of the importance of youth consciousness, knowledge consumption, and collective action in an oil and gas economy. I'll start off with a small story. While I was at Milner Hall at UWI in Trinidad, there was a renaming of the hall process that was happening. We acknowledged that Lord Milner, Viscount Milner, was a racist colonial administrator who played a very important role in oppressing peoples in South Africa, etc. And considering the reparations push of the University of the West Indies, it was not in the university's best interest to have this space on the campus named after this man. And so they started to find ways to get the Milnerites, as we were called, involved in the process. And so they set out that, okay, names would be submitted to the administration, and when those names are submitted, we would then give them to the hall, and then the hall, the young people themselves, would then decide on who or what the hall should be named after. So we got the list of names and we started to pull it together. We hated the idea of changing the name of the hall in the first place, and we wanted to keep some of the paraphernalia that we had, which had the M on it. And so there were 4 names that came that were to be considered. CLR James, Professor Brian Copeland, Freedom Hall, Patrick Manning. Of course, most of these are Trinidad references. Huh? And the Milnerites tried to insert one more, Maroon Hall, basing it on the idea that maroon villages in the Jamaica and the revolutionary sense of what happened in those spaces, and that maroon was already the color of the hall. They sought to insert this in the last leg. That couldn't happen. I said to them, the options that you have put forward are incorrect in terms of university regulations. You can't have any political figures, you can't have any ideological figures, and you can't have somebody who's alive because they could very well do something and you have to rename the hall again. So they submitted the list of 5. Of course, they had the one that wasn't even on the list originally. And then when the university came back to them and said, okay, from the list of 5 that you submitted, one qualifies as Freedom Hall, they got vexed. And they kicked up storm. They kicked up storm because they felt as though they really wanted maroon. But I wasn't going to support that, because what should have been happening from the inception was some amount of knowledge consumption to ensure that the decision that you make was an informed decision in keeping with the regulations. And it comes to a point about the need to consume knowledge as we move into these discourse. In the Guyanese context, we have Article 13, which sets out the relationship of governance, which is outside of government. And it really speaks about the principal objective of the political system, which is to create these opportunities for persons to get involved in the management of the affairs. And of course, when we speak about that engagement, it speaks about youth as well, in order to advance an inclusionary democracy. There's also this thing called the ladder of engagement, for which at the top of that ladder is where there are young people's initiatives and input, and where young people work along in partnership with adults. And the bottom of the ladder, it's manipulation, where adults use young people to support their own projects and pretend they are the result of young people's inspiration. And this comes from Roger Hart's ladder of youth participation. When we consider who exactly will gain access to the opportunities that come out of oil and gas, the numbers are very small. The hope is high, but the numbers are small. When it translates to the amount of jobs that will be created and people are hoping to benefit, hope is high, but the reality is small. And so persons have thought of these creative ways to make sure that they benefit in some way from the money that is going to come from oil and gas. And so we're exploring the idea of subsidizing university education, for example, for which a decision like that still leaves out a section of the population. Those persons who themselves can't get access to university education because of certain structural shortcomings. And then when we think about some other things that are advanced, for example, the $5,000 cash grant that was proposed, there's a mass hysteria surrounding it because people feel uneasy about poor people getting free money, as opposed to looking at it as a sort of a public assistance, as a sort of affirmative action to make sure that people's circumstances are alleviated by giving them the opportunity to have income because all the previous measures we've tried to employ have not worked. When you consider how exactly young people are represented in the process now, for prioritizing, for example, there are two things that you can look at. One, when Conservation International invited the GNYC to be part of this working group on the green paper that came out to the Ministry of Finance. And we looked at the investment committee that was set up. There was no representation for special interest groups, for example, women, the indigenous people, and youth. And the input that we put in was that, you know what, this body ought to be a bit more diverse than just technical persons who come from banking institutions, insurance institutions, etc. And so we advanced that. We have actually the Natural Resource Fund, for which the bill went through Parliament and was finally assented to by His Excellency. And you barely see it published in the Gazette the other day. I was surprised when I saw the article. I went to the Gazette and saw it there with His Excellency's signature. And inside of it, they had an oversight committee established. And part of the oversight committee is a youth representative, decided on by a consortium of youth organizations who would then choose their representatives. It remains to be seen how this process has worked in the past, especially as it relates to the establishment of constitutional commissions, for example, and how youth are really and truly represented, whether they're independent in constitutional commissions. And so we are now at a place where the only solution that we really have for ensuring that young people have a sort of a say is to increase civic and political engagement of youth in the decision-making process of the country. And that is not to say them getting involved in political parties, but that's dishonest. Article 13 gives each and every person that space for them to actually engage in decision-making without going into political parties, which in themselves are repressive hierarchies with strong political agendas, for which young people are usually left behind, and for which they are brought in because they have a strong snatch culture, but eventually the spear kicks in. So that's what we're advocating. Civic and political engagement is not that. It's Article 13 in its most true sense, bringing out an inclusionary democracy. And finally, how exactly do you compel a state to engage its youth? Through a national youth policy, which to this date, we started the consultation process in 2013, it was brought to us again in 2015, it was passed through the National Assembly in 2016, and here we are in 2019 with it going back to Cabinet, even before there was a National Youth Empowerment Action Plan. And that's where we are right now, where we have to now revise that social contract between youth and the administration, but for which we're not exactly sure how that's going to work out, considering the current political climate and the Chief Justice's ruling on the Cabinet meeting. Thank you.